a time where heroes lived. People like Salahuddin, who gave his life for Islam, our legacy.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praise belongs to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be upon His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We welcome you, our dear viewers, taking a look at Islamic history. Today, inshallah, we're going to be studying the history of an amazing part of the Muslim world. A part of the Muslim world that a lot of us, unfortunately, don't know about. Maybe we've heard some things about it, but our knowledge of it is very limited, and that is the history of Islam in China. In China, inshallah. Now, I'll ask Liban, for example. I'll start giving an example of something. When I say the name Aladdin, Aladdin from the cartoons and things like this, what do you usually think of?
Like maybe flying carpets, the Middle East, things like this.
You think of the Middle East. I mean, you watch the cartoon of Aladdin, it looks like the streets of Cairo. You wouldn't know any better. How many of us realize the story of Aladdin is actually set in China?
In China. It isn't maybe in Baghdad or...
No. Aladdin was set in China. Aladdin is a Chinese Muslim living in China.
So he's a historical person.
I don't know. It's a tale that was made up. He wasn't a real person.
I think it was a tale, but the architecture and the graphic they did, it looks like Chinese, but also all of us, we felt it was like in the Middle East.
Because you see that many parts of China, especially going towards the west of China, it's not China like of Beijing and all of these areas. You get to the areas where it's almost 100% Muslim.
He looks kind of Pakistani. His clothing looks Pakistani.
Of course, this is how Disney understands Aladdin.
And what was Aladdin? He was a mujahid, traveler, what?
Aladdin, in the end, this is just a tale. He was a man who rubbed a magic lamp and fell in love with his woman. Yeah. So this is, of course, the story is nonsense. But the example that I love to give is that Aladdin was a Chinese Muslim. This is something that flies over most people's heads. And if you read the story of Aladdin, in the first few sentences, it says Aladdin was in China. So this is something to introduce that, yes, there are Muslims in China. They play a great part in the history of the Ummah, but they've been largely forgotten, unfortunately. Now, when we look at the spread of Islam, as we know, we've mentioned, Islam spread throughout the Middle East, from Mecca, going, in all directions. And Islam spread through what we call the Silk Roads. The Silk Road is basically the way between the Middle East and China, the Central Asian states. Now, from the very beginning of Islam, we're talking at the time of Uthman, radiallahu anhu, he sent an envoy to China. So he sent a group of Muslims to China. And one of the people he sent was the Sahabi Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, radiallahu anhu. So Sa'ad, he actually visited China. He was an envoy on behalf of Uthman. And it said that his father actually came with him. So Abi Waqqas, his father, came, and he's actually buried in China. And there was a masjid that was built, because when the Chinese emperor received them, he was so proud, to have a relation with the Muslim empire, that he built a masjid in their honor. He built the masjid of the Huaixiang Mosque. Huaixiang, it actually means like a memorial mosque. And the reason why he did this, the Chinese emperor, was to honor the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was actually erected in the memory of the Prophet. So he said, this empire that was started by him, the relations that we have, I want to build a masjid on your behalf. And at the Huaixiang Mosque, it said that the father of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, Abi Waqqas himself, is actually buried there. Subhanallah. So it's interesting to see. This is China that we're talking about.
So it's basically someone from that time, that early in Islam, that you would think might be buried in the Middle East is actually buried in China.
Yeah, he's buried in China.
It's not tested. Is he buried in Middle East or in the China? You have only rumors. Maybe he's...
Sa'ad, a lot of people, they say Sa'ad was buried there. This is not true. This is where the discrepancy comes. But the father of Sa'ad...
so Waqqas is buried here.
Abi Waqqas himself, he's actually buried.
So how was the story of the entrance of Islam to this area?
Well, what happened as we're looking, the Prophet, Uthman radiallahu anhu, he sent his envoy. So Muslims were visiting China very early on. They were going there for trades. The Chinese wanted to trade with the Muslims wanted to trade with the Chinese. So you had this relationship going on of traders going through and actually became established in here. Now, you see that from where Sa'ad actually visited. There was a city called Guangzhou. Later on became known as Canton. It was one of the largest cities in the world up until now, and even at the time, it was one of the largest cities in the world.
Canton, I think there is a big market every year there.
I'm sure there's a big market in many places in China every year. You have a big market in China. A small market probably means 1 million people. Yeah, China's a very big country, but no doubt, trade up until today, trade is a large part of the Chinese culture, and we're going to sort of elaborate on this a little bit later. How the trade relationship between the Muslims and China continues until today. So we saw at this time, very early on, we're talking in the year 616. This happens. This is not long after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Guangzhou had 4 mosques, 4 very big mosques that were built in this early stage. And as we said, you had the father of Sa'ad that was buried there. Now, going on later, the Muslims didn't really influence Da'wah very strong. For the next 300-400 years, there were only very small steps made. It wasn't really till the year 1000 when a new dynasty took over. It was called the Song dynasty. Now, once the Song dynasty came into power, they actually put a Muslim in charge of all of their trade affairs. Like, how you've got a trade minister who looks after all of the trade? It was actually a Muslim. The office of the director of the general of shipping was always held by a Muslim. The law of the dynasty said that a Muslim must hold this, because the Muslims were the key to trade.
They were the most trustable people.
Yeah, they were trustworthy, but they were also a key. And the Chinese saw this. The Chinese saw that using the Muslims, would benefit themselves, and it would benefit the Muslims. And you saw they had a respect for Islam. The emperor would build a masjid in honor of the Muslims.
And emperor not have any problems with Islam or with Muslims.
No, generally you find most of the emperors, they didn't really have any issues. They had very, very good relationship with the Muslims.
So you could say that China in the early stages of Islam was actually pro-Islamic?
From the beginning, you definitely saw most of the emperors welcome the Muslims. I mean, during the Song dynasty, the emperor at this time, he actually invited 5,500 Muslims from Bukhara. Bukhara is in Central Asia, we know from Imam Bukhari. He came from Bukhara. The emperor he actually invited 5,500 Muslims to settle just north of Beijing.
For what? For what reason?
The reason why he wanted them to come to Beijing is because he knew the Muslims were very noble warriors. Unlike many of the Chinese at a time, as you see, the dynasties are changing. You got the Ming dynasty, you got the Song dynasty, the Qing. It's changing very quickly. Most of the Chinese, they might not always remain loyal. But he saw the Muslims, on the other hand, were very, noble warriors.
He took them as his personal guards. Or
what he did is, because just north of Beijing, so sort of going closer towards the Korean Peninsula, you had an empire that was known as the Liao Empire. And the Liao Empire was threatening the Song dynasty. So rather than putting Chinese, his own brethren, Han Chinese, in power, he invited these Muslims from Bukhara, because he said they're going to do a better job than what the Chinese would do defending my land. So he invited these Muslims. Now, they were actually led by an emir, and his name was Amir.
Prince Amir.
He was known as Prince Amir. But you see, Prince Amir, he actually took on a Chinese name as well. So the people, they knew him as Sol Fai-er. Sol Fai-er, this was his Chinese name. Otherwise, the Muslims in Arabic, they knew him as Amir. Now, because he was one of the first Muslims to really establish themselves with a great respect, they were invited by the emperor. These are people who were very close to the heart of the emperor. The Muslims in China today, they call him the father of Islam. Because really, before you had people trading, going in and out, but he's the first one who really settled in China. And he didn't just settle in China, he was invited by the emperor and had a great respect for the emperor and actually protected them. So that even the Chinese will respect this man. And of course, the Chinese Muslims, out of respect for this, they call him the father of Islam in China.
imagine, for example, for maybe Barack Obama invites you to Washington.
After what you said now,
We won't go too far into this.
yeah, after what you said now, I just feel more proud as a Muslim. I feel that Islam started with a pride-in way, started like pride in this area. A lot of people, they started to look at Muslims to be leaders, to be chosen as people has a responsibility.
Yeah.
Subhanallah.
And this is how the emperor saw them, and they showed gratitude to the Muslims. And you see, at this time, in the Chinese language, they actually used to call Islam Da Shifa. Da Shifa, it means the law of the Arabs. Now, what happened was the Amir, what he actually did, Prince Amir, he said, this name is not suitable. You had to say the law of the Arabs, because as we said at the start, the majority of the Muslims that the emperor, the dynasty knew were the Arabs that were trading with them. So I said, you know, their religion is the law of the Arabs. But now you got Muslims from Bukhara. You got Muslims coming. They're not Arabs. They're from Central Asia. You know, from where Imam Bukhari was from.
Maybe Persians or something like that.
Yeah, closely related to Persians. Then we're not Arabs. So what happened was when they actually mixed in with the Chinese people, they became known as the Hui. Because in China you've got many groups. The largest group, usually what we call Chinese, they're called the Han. The Han are like the normal Chinese-looking people that you've got. You've got a few other groups, but the Han are the majority. Now the Muslims, they mixed with the Han, and they became known as the Hui. So the religion of Islam, the name was actually changed. Amir, he said to the emperor, change the name from Da Shifa to Hui Hui Jiao, which means the religion of the Hui. And Hui, by default, it meant the Muslims. So you see, the emperor said, no problem. So from that point onwards, you know, you had to refer to Muslims as Hui. You couldn't refer to them as Arabs.
Just
Do you know how many clans were at that time that existed in China?
You find that there were many, many tribes. I mean, the Han were the majority. They, up until now, they probably form about 80 to 90% of the people. But they were the ones in towards the east of China. Once you got towards the west and the south, this is where you got different groups. You got the Tibetans, you got the Uyghurs, who we'll talk about soon, inshallah.
And why the Amir was so loyal for this emperor?
He was loyal because the emperor invited him, gave him a job, said, "I'll show you respect. You respect me," and it's of mutual benefit. It's something that worked well for them.
For example, in time of Yusuf alayhi salam, he was like a minister of finance in the king's in Egypt, in the kingdom of Egypt.
Indeed. So you see, his involvement with the emperor meant that Muslims won respect. And they definitely did. From this point onwards, as we said, he became called the father of Islam.
So basically, I was just thinking about how you said when the Chinese thought it was the law of the Arabs. I mean, it just shows that the stereotypes, even till today, people just think, Islam is a religion for the Arabs.
They're calling Islam like Mohammedanism or something like that.
Yeah. It's something that's hard to sort of buck this trend, that people always look the religion of the Arabs. Yeah, they don't realize that the Arabs form a minority of Muslims. You got more Muslims in China than you do in Syria. There's something amazing. There are more Muslims in China than Syria.
Some sources say that there are more Muslims in China than maybe in Egypt. Some sources.
Yeah, depending on how you calculate the number of Muslims. So we're definitely going to get towards this at the end.
From what we get now from the history of China, as we see, it's not the religion of Arab, it's the religion of Allah, Islam, or submission. Something else we get now, that Muslims should be loyal to the community he lives in or to the country he lives in.
If they show him respect, as you see with the emperor, he's like,
Indeed.
come to our land, we'll give you respect, and we'll get along well. And this gives a chance for Islam to actually take place in the country. And this is where Islam began to spread. As we said, people came trading, they'd go in and out. They never had much of an effect. Like as we looked in Southeast Asia, the traders had a minimal effect. They introduced the religion.
After scholars came, they changed things. So
Once
I think
the scholars
maybe in
teach,
China was the same thing when scholars came.
this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that once the Muslims were actually settled and won respect of the emperor, they were able to teach their religion. And we saw, the Muslims started to have, honor, and they were able to establish Islam in China. Now, after this, the Song dynasty eventually fell. Now, we're going to fast forward to the year 1270, 1270. You've got the Yuan dynasty. Now, the Yuan dynasty, this sort of coincides with the Mongols. We're going to look a little bit more at the Mongols. The Mongols actually conquered, you could say, about half of the world. And they started with China. China, because Mongolia is just above China. So one of the first places they conquered was China. And it became known as the Yuan dynasty. Now, the Yuan dynasty, in some ways, is a high point for the Muslims. And in another way, it becomes a low point for the Muslims. Why? Because of the relationship with the dynasty.
Sheikh, I just have a general question here. Why does each dynasty changed names? What's the difference between each dynasty?
What would happen is, they'd be named either after the founder or a name of an ethnic group. Like the Yuan were Mongols, and they're different to the Han. You got the Han dynasty, for example. You got the Qing dynasty, who was named after, one of their ancestors. So this is just the name that is put in. Still, they refer to their land as China. China, or as you'd say in Chinese, Zhenghua. Zhenghua, it means Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom, why? Because they believe they're in the middle of the world. To the east you had Japan, which was called, the land of the rising sun. And then, of course, in the far west you had Al-Maghrib, which in China means the place where the sun sets, Morocco. So you see, these were the two extremes, and the Chinese believed they were in the middle of the world. Now, we refer to them as the East, because we know in reality they're to the east, of the Eurasian subcontinent, the Eurasian, macrocontinent. But they refer to themselves as the middle of the world. And it's from this name Zhenghua that, most of the, you actually get this name China that was taken from this. From Zhenghua to China, it sounds like a big jump. But, through the etymological changes over time, this is how this name came about.
Interesting to know.
It's interesting to see how names change over time.
You know that the Chinese, they have a Chinese centrical history. So it is maybe Muslims, they are in some ways are shy because of their history. But Chinese, they said that they are in the middle of the world.
Oh, they weren't ashamed. They said, we rule the world. We're at the middle of the world.
Nowadays.
Yes. Now, we see in the Yuan dynasty, as I said, in many ways it become a high point. And if you went to the 14th century, under the Yuan dynasty, there were 4 million Muslims in China. Isn't it amazing?
From which number of people?
How do you mean, sorry?
From which number of population? 4 million from maybe...
the total population of the dynasty, I'm not too sure. But we know that there were 4 million Muslims.
It's a very, very big number for maybe in that time, for the 14th century.
Yeah,
you had in Europe in that time below 100 million.
Yeah.
So it's a big number.
This is a large amount of Muslims, 4 million Muslims. This is larger than some countries today. That's how many Muslims there were in China in the 14th century. So you see, under the Yuan dynasty, under the Mongols, the Muslims were allowed to prosper.
They start with 5,000 and now all these numbers.
Yeah, you see how big. And one of the reasons why is because the Yuan dynasty, in the beginning, they were favorable towards Muslims. They wanted Muslims to migrate.
When Islam entered the Chinese peninsula, did it change the culture drastically, or did the Chinese actually build a masajid and stuff like that in their own way?
This is interesting to note. We see in the beginning, the majority of the masajid were built by an Arab style. Later on, though, you actually saw a change. As the Muslims became more integrated, and we'll be looking at that in a moment, inshallah, the masjids were actually built in a Chinese way. And it would be good to take a look at some images. You can see some masajids. And the masjid, it looks like a Chinese building.
Huisheng Mosque, it is like a ordinary building in China.
The Huisheng, even though it was rebuilt over time, this one still, you can see some Arabic elements. Still some, Persian elements. But you get later, like the Grand Mosque of Xi'an, for example, the minaret. The minaret looks like a Chinese pagoda. You look at it, it's not the big traditional minaret. It's a very wide, layered building, with the curves at the side. It looks like you're looking at a traditional Chinese palace, and this is just the minaret. You see the masjid itself. This masjid is amazing. It's using Chinese architecture, but it's a Muslim masjid. It's beautiful to see these buildings, how they did eventually blend in with the Chinese culture. Now, at that time, when we had the Yuan dynasty, as we were saying, Kublai Khan, he was related to Genghis Khan. He actually started to invite many Muslims. He would say to them, come and migrate to China. And Kublai, he actually divided China into 12 different territories. So he divided it into 12 different regions. 8 of these 12 regions were ruled by Muslims.
8 regions?
8 of the regions out of the 12 were ruled by Muslims. I mean, there's only 4 ruled by non-Muslims.
In the era of Genghis Khan?
Genghis Khan, I think he was enemy of Islam. He killed many.
He came later on.
This is interesting to note, because once we look at the Mongol invasion, we're going to take a look at this in a little bit more detail. How Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, and many of these people, a lot of the Mongol leaders claimed to be Muslims. They claimed to be following Islam. And they wanted to look after the Muslims. And you see in China, they really favored the Muslims, because the Mongols were not Han Chinese. They were Mongols. So they didn't trust the Han, who were the majority. So they favored the Muslims, who they found were loyal, respectful. They were noble warriors. So they had
in this time, they was their name was Juan.
Which one? Sorry.
These Muslims, Chinese Muslims, Juan. They
These
trusted
were
the Juan than the Han.
Yes. The Hui.
Hui. Sorry.
They trusted the Hui much more than the Han. And really, ethnically speaking, there's no difference between a Hui and a Han. They're of the same ethnicity generally, except the Hui are Muslims. This was the main difference. So as we said, under the Yuan dynasty, we had 4 million Muslims in China. Out of the 12 provinces, 8 of them were 8 of the leaders were Muslims. So this is showing the strength.
Quarters.
Out of what, sorry?
3/4 of provinces were led by Muslims. For example, if we have now today in Europe, in the 3/4 of countries, Muslim presidents,
it would be amazing. But this was China. This is the history of the Muslims in China. Now we see that the leader of the Muslims in China at the time, under the Yuan dynasty, his name was Amiruddin. Now Amiruddin was an amazing man. You find again the respect that the Mongol, the Yuan dynasty gave him. Their capital city, at the time it was called Khanbaliq. Khanbaliq later became known as Beijing. It was actually established by the Mongols. They employed Amiruddin, who was the leader of the Muslims. He was a very talented man in architecture. He had mastered Persian architecture and Chinese architecture, Islamic architecture, and he would blend them together. So the Mongol leaders of the Yuan dynasty actually employed him to design Beijing.
He was Mongolian.
He was a Muslim.
Muslim.
Amiruddin was a Muslim.
So a Muslim built today capital of China.
At that time, it was called Khanbaliq. He actually designed the majority of it. And what he did is, as I said, he blended Confucian architecture with Islamic architecture, mixing many things together. So you can say Beijing, the foundation of Beijing, was designed by a Muslim. Now this is something amazing to see. You can go. There's a place in Beijing. There's a lake in a place called Beihai Park. You can still visit this today. In the middle, there's a place called Chonghua. Chonghua, it's actually it's like a beautiful garden in the middle of this lake. This was designed by Amiruddin. So anyone who visits Beijing, you must go to see this place. You're going to see a beautiful mixture. It looks very Chinese, but it was designed by a Muslim. So for those who visit, and this is one of the lasting legacies.
So Muslims bought their print till now.
Indeed, you can see that you do have many of these lasting legacies that you can see today, and you can still visit in China, which will be a great thing to do for anyone who visits. So we're going to go for a break here. Dear viewers, do stay tuned. We'll be back in a short moment looking at the history of Islam in China.
Our legacy. Our legacy.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the show, dear viewers, where we're looking at the history of Islam, focusing on the history of Islam in China. So we saw the role of the Muslims in the Yuan dynasty. And as I mentioned, there were high points. And we say these were many of the high points. Having, Muslims who designed Beijing, the architecture, the respect that was paid to the Muslims. But as we said, the Yuan dynasty were Mongols. And the Mongols weren't the best people towards the Muslims. They were actually waging war with many of the Muslims in the Western fronts. And you saw later on, especially Genghis Khan, he changed many of his policies towards the Muslims. So one of them, for example, is he banned the slaughtering of animals in a halal manner. So it was illegal to do halal slaughtering. This is one of the laws of Genghis Khan. So no doubt, this made the Muslims very upset. The law of Genghis Khan, the Yasa, it actually said you're not allowed to slaughter an animal. What you have to do is you have to cut its chest open and rip out its heart. And this was the way that the Mongols would slaughter an animal. So of course, as Muslims, we know this is impermissible. You have to slaughter it in a halal. It's actually more beneficial for the animal. It's more humane.
It's more healthy.
It's healthy. So this was actually made illegal. So you see, the Muslims now, after all of these good relations with the government, now all of a sudden they're running into problems. It said some of the Muslims actually called to Genghis Khan, and he said, all of the people slaughter the animal how we tell you to do, except you Muslims. Why is that? And he said, because our religion mandates that we must slaughter the animal. And he said, well, I say that you shouldn't slaughter the animal. What do you say to this? And he said, I can't submit to this. And so he became very, very angry. And he started to oppress many of the Muslims because they refused to obey him. So this became one, you see, it was one of the low points of the Muslims, in the Yuan dynasty. Now, because of this, you found many Muslims started to rebel against the Yuan. Because you had the Han. Remember, we're talking about the ethnic Chinese. They really resented the fact that Mongols were ruling their lands. So as the Mongols were being defeated, inshallah, we're going to talk about this in great detail, once we look at the Mongol invasion. They were being defeated by the Muslims, the Mamluks in Egypt. The Han said, we're going to take advantage, and we're going to attack the Mongols as well. So the Muslims joined them. The Muslims joined the Han in fighting against the Yuan.
4 million. And the Han, I think, maybe like them.
Yeah, they were very big in number, even more than the Muslims. So what they actually did is they defeated the Mongols. They actually overthrew the Mongols. And the Muslims, they were some of the main players in this overthrow, this rebellion against the Yuan dynasty. So now we fast forward to the Ming dynasty. Once the Yuan had been displaced, the Mongols were kicked out, you had the Ming dynasty. Now this is the golden age of Islam. The Ming dynasty, they were Han Chinese. And they were very, very favorable to the Muslims. Now, the founder of the Ming dynasty, his name was Zhu Yongzhang. Now, he actually founded this dynasty, and he had in his, the whole army, he had 6 Muslim generals. Now, of course, putting a general of the army is a very sensitive position. These are people, if you don't trust them, they can have a coup and overthrow you. He had 6 of his generals, they were Muslims. So he sent one of them, who was his most trusted general, to actually go and to continue fighting the Mongols. As we know, the Mongols, they started to attack China again. So the Chinese, they built the Great Wall of China. I'm sure most of us have seen, this long wall which snakes through the mountains.
So that was the reason of building that one of the world miracles, the 7 miracles.
Yeah, this massive structure, it was actually built to keep the Mongols out. And who did he trust with defending this?
The 6 generals?
One of the Muslim generals.
Oh.
His name was Lan Yu. Lan Yu, he was a Muslim general, and he was the most trusted. The emperor, Zhu Yongzhang, he trusted him above all of the other generals, this Muslim. So what he did is he was the one responsible for defeating the Mongols. He made sure that they weren't going to ever invade China again. So you can understand this emperor, he's going to be very thankful to the Muslims. Now, you see an amazing thing that actually happened. This emperor, he had such a love for Islam. He had such a love for the Muslims that he actually wrote a famous poem. It's called the 100-word eulogy. It was a poem that he wrote in honor of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he actually commanded, because he built many masajid. Again, because he was thankful to the Muslims.
He was Muslim.
He wasn't a Muslim. I'm going to read to you his poem. And it's going to sound like this man's a Muslim from what he's saying. And Allah knows best what was in his heart. But at least he was thankful to the Muslims for defending his empire. He trusted them. He kept them close. So he wrote what's called the 100-word eulogy. I'm going to read this to you, inshallah. Just listen to the beautiful words. This is written by a Chinese emperor, one of the most powerful men in the world at that time, writing a poem about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he said, I'll tell you how it was written first. It's written 4 Chinese characters at a time. And each line is made up of 4 Chinese characters. So he said, since the creation of the universe, God had already appointed this great faith-preaching man. From the West he was born and received the Holy Scripture, a book made of 30 parts, meaning the 30 juz of the Quran, to guide all of creation, the master of all rulers, the leader of the holy ones, with support from the heavens to protect his nation, with 5 daily prayers, silently hoping for peace, his heart directed towards Allah, giving power to the poor, saving them from calamity, seeing through the unseen, pulling the souls and the spirits away from all wrongdoings, a mercy to the worlds, transversing the ancient majestic path, vanquishing away all evil, his religion pure and true, Muhammad, the noble and great one. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Coming out from Muwahhid heart.
Allah knows best. Really, when you hear these words, you can't help but think this is a Muslim.
This is a Muslim.
Right.
Yes.
It sounds like a Muslim.
poet did in that time. Sounds like a poem coming out from Runda in Andalus.
It really, I mean, you hear these words and you can't think, if he wasn't a Muslim, at least he loved Islam. Now what he did is, he actually established many masjids all around China. He built hundreds of masjids. And he said, I want this poem to be put in every masjid in China. And so you actually see some of the masajid until today, they still have this poem written by this Chinese emperor.
So is that a good like evidence or reason to tell people that those they accuse Islam that it spread down in this area with sword?
This shows that, no, of course this isn't the case.
That was an emperor, and he loved Islam with this way, and he started to trust Muslim with this way, and he started to speak about Islam with this way, and subhanallah, he was praising Islam. So
no doubt about it. And this shows at the same time, as Muslims living in a land, when you do actually, I'm not always saying you have to obey the government, but when the government gives you respect and puts you in that position of honor, you're going to find that you're going to have a good cooperation. You're not going to put your trust in them, but you're going to see that you can work together to bring about goods.
If the Muslims were so respected and the emperor respected him so much, then why are the Muslims right now in China so oppressed?
This is what we're going to get towards taking a look. This is the golden age of Islam. The golden age has to be good. If that was the golden age, today we're in less than the bronze age. Things are not very good for the Muslims at the moment. Now, at this time as well, you see that the emperor actually appointed an admiral of the Chinese Navy, and this admiral was
Zheng He?
Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He, or as he was known, Haji Mahmud Shamsuddin. He was an amazing admiral. He was a very, very religious man. He was appointed as the admiral, and he actually, as we mentioned in the episode about Southeast Asia, he was responsible for spreading Islam throughout Southeast Asia. Not completely, but he was the one who consolidated a lot of the power. He sent scholars to this land. This was a man who made Hajj. He took many of his boats, one of the first Chinese Muslims to actually perform the Hajj, an admiral of the Chinese Navy, subhanallah. We see he was a man who had great respect. And scholars, they differ. Scholars of history, some of them suggest that if you look at the maps of Zheng He, you look at his the stories of his travels, it seems, and Allah knows best, that he actually made it to America.
Because in that time the Chinese fleet was the best in the world. In that time,
it was the best navy, and it was led by this
the
Muslim.
best admiral that time was Muslim.
Yeah, this was Zheng He.
And can we see on the Colombo boats were the Muslims, so we can that the Muslims were the best sailers in that time.
Yeah.
And the best administrators and the all best. So if we saw that time, if we see that in that time and compare to this time, we will see that we are in today that we are like I don't say like a retard or. Comparing to that time.
It is a fair comparison. It is definitely a fair comparison. So we see that the Muslims were at the forefront. They were the admirals of the Chinese army. They were, the admirals of the Chinese Navy. They were the generals of the Chinese army. They were the governors of provinces. Even the emperor himself, Allah who might have been a Muslim. Again, we heard these words. It's hard to say this man doesn't sound like a Muslim. You found that, it was around this time that most of the masjids started to be built in the Chinese style, as you were asking about before. So you found that they started to build the masjids in the pagoda style, in the traditional Chinese style, meaning they really started to become integrated with Chinese culture. You found cities like Nanjing, and Nanjing used to be one of the capitals of the Chinese Empire, and many people say it really should be the capital today, because it's a more strategic location than Beijing. This became one of the major centers of Islamic learning in the entire world.
And people was living harmony in this time. There was no problem inside.
There was great harmony. There were no problems. People.
So until now, the Muslims are without problems until that time.
At this time, under that dynasty, when we're looking at the Ming dynasty, we're actually seeing there were no problems. The Muslims, really, they were at the top. This was the golden era. The Muslims were educated. They were in these positions.
It's also golden era for the China, because we know the ceramic from that time, the vases from that time. It is like
Yeah, it was a high time for the Muslims and for China in general.
Now that the Mongols have gone, and the Han were majority non-Muslims in this golden age, were maybe some of them joining the Huan in Islam, or
In terms of how many are embracing Islam, no doubt you do hear stories of this, especially at this time where the emperor really tolerated and respected Islam. You do hear stories of many of the Han becoming Muslims, because now we find the majority of the Muslims in the west of the country, but back then, Beijing, you would find many Muslims. Beijing had many masajid. Guangzhou, it was full of masajids. The Han were really embracing Islam. So this is something
This
that was...
poem was like a hub for embracing Islam.
Yeah.
This poem.
This poem itself, when you know your emperor is praising Islam like this, you're going to be interested in embracing Islam.
Dawah for Islam.
This is da'wah by a non-Muslim.
Subhanallah.
Inshallah, we hope he was a Muslim, but at least by his name, he was a non-Muslim. So this is the golden age. Now, after the golden age, things can only go down. After this peak that we had of the Muslims,
Dark ages.
now we're going down. We had the Qing dynasty. Now, the Qing dynasty was the last Chinese dynasty. And we talk about dynasty as being, the old style of Chinese government. The Qing dynasty was in power from 1644 until 1911, until the Chinese Nationalist Revolution. Now, under the Qing dynasty, things were very, very different, because the Qing, they weren't Han. They're called a Manchu. Manchu, they're very closely related to the Mongols. They weren't exactly Mongols, but they were some of the descendants of the Mongols. So the Han really resented them. And this is one of the reasons why you had the Chinese Revolution. Now, under the Manchus, they weren't very favorable towards the Muslims. You had many revolts. You found especially the Muslims were the ones pushing these revolts. Because the moment they had their rights taken away, they would say to the dynasty, this isn't right. So they'd revolt, they'd try to get rid of the government, then the government would give them like a piece of candy. To keep quiet, have the candy.
Did they have success in these rebellions?
The which, sorry?
Did they have success in that?
They weren't too successful. In terms of actually toppling the government, it never happened. It wasn't like before where the Muslims actually joined with the Han. This time you find, they weren't as united. The Manchu dynasty was very tactful in keeping, all of the different provinces really divided. But, in the south, in Yunnan was one of the main bases of the Muslims. For a long time, this was one of the main Muslim provinces. After the Chinese Revolution, most of them migrated to Taiwan. The majority of the Taiwanese Muslims, they're from Yunnan. At this time, Yunnan is where you had a lot of
Greece.
rebellions.
We're not talking about Greece, right?
About, sorry?
We're not talking about Greece here, are we?
Looks like
No, not
the word in
Yunnan.
Arabic.
Good.
Not Yunnan.
Greece
This
is-
the Yunnan province. The Chinese name of it. They
Just making
sound
sure.
very similar. So you had many revolts. Yunnan was, a hotbed of fighting against the government. Now this happened. Still, the Muslims continued living, but you didn't have these high points. To a large degree, Islam wasn't granted the same respect in the previous dynasties. This happened until 1911. Now, 1911, a lot of people would have heard about the Chinese Revolution. What happened was the Han stood up, and rather than putting in another dynasty or you have another emperor, they had what was called a nationalist revolution. They said, away with all of these, emperors and dynasties and all of this. We want to set up a modern nation, which was the trend at the time. You're getting rid of the monarchy and putting in, like a democratic form of government. So the Chinese, they were led by a man, his name was Sun Yat-sen. Now, Sun Yat-sen, he's regarded as the hero of, the father of modern China, the one who did away with the monarchy. Now, Sun Yat-sen, he was actually a Christian. He embraced Christianity at a young age. And
Christian.
he was
I
a
thought
Christian.
that he was maybe a Buddhist or Taoist, but
He would have been, being an ethnic Chinese, maybe his background was Confucian or Buddhist or something like this. But I think he became a Methodist at a young age. And you found that the majority of the people joining the nationalist revolution at this time were the Christians, because Christianity started to slowly enter into China. If you were to look at the Opium Wars and things like this, you're going to find a long history of the government, really outlawing the Christians. But now, once the nationalist revolution came about, the Christians had free reign. Now their leader, the leader of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen, he was a Christian himself. However, he wasn't a Christian, without tactic. He was a Christian who allied himself with the Muslims.
Allied with the Muslims.
Allied with the Muslims.
He's the one that introduced communism to China?
No. This is, we're going to get this a little bit later, the communist revolution. The first revolution was the nationalist revolution, where the main call that he had was for democracy. He said, we want democracy for China. And what he did is he actually started to ally himself. His political party was the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang, eventually they were defeated by the communists, and they also fled to Taiwan.
So this democracy he's looking for, so basically he wants to just stop dynasties with rulers, or?
Yeah, they said enough with the dynasties, it's time for China to move on to democracy. So this was the nationalist revolution. Now Sun Yat-sen, he allied himself with the Muslims in the West, because he realized that, that he needed the support of the Muslims to actually have the revolution succeed.
And the Muslim agreed to ally with him.
It's interesting what you had happening at this time, because the Muslim world was starting to open up. For most of these centuries, the Muslims in China, they didn't really interact very much with most of the Muslim worlds. As far as they went was Persia, Southeast Asia, but further than this, you didn't have much interaction. Now going back, at the start of the 19th century, Muslims are traveling for Hajj in large numbers. And many of them started to adopt Islamic political ideologies taken from the West, talking about the West of China. So, for example, you had a group who were known as the Yihawani. Yihawani comes from Ikhwani.
Yeah, it looks like this.
So you've got Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, based in Egypt from Hassan al-Banna.
Sheikh Hassan al-Banna.
Now, this message spread all throughout the Middle East, throughout Central Asia, until it reached China. So you got the Yihawani. So the Yihawani, they were one of the groups that actually supported the Kuomintang, the nationalist revolution. You had another group who they're known as the Gedimo. Gedimo comes from Qadim. Gedimo from Qadimu. So they were the old school Muslims, if you like. So they were the ones who, the Ikhwani came and they started to, say, a lot of what you're doing is bid'ah. You've been mixing Confucianism and Islam, for example. We need to purify this.
How was that? How was that?
How what, sorry?
How was that?
You had a lot of conflict, because the old style, the Qadimu, and you also had other groups like the Jahriya. The Jahriya were a Sufi group. The Khafiya, they were also a Sufi group. They were opposed to the Ikhwanis, because the Ikhwanis, or the Yihawani, we'll call them, they came along and started to shake things up, saying, this isn't how they do it in Mecca. This isn't how they do it in the Middle East. We have to go back to the roots. However, the Yihawani themselves, over time, became corrupted. You find there was a group who actually took power of the Yihawani. They were called the Ma group. Now, the word Ma was actually the Chinese way of saying Muhammad, because you find most Chinese names, they get contracted to one syllable. So Muhammad became Ma. Musa became Mu, for example. So this was a group they were called the Ma group, because all of these 5 Muslim generals, their last name was Muhammad, or Ma. They were known as the Ma group. Now, what they did is they were actually Ikhwanis, Yihawani, and they supported the nationalist government. But the nationalist government, even though it was ruled by a Christian, Sun Yat-sen, they were still very traditional Confucianists. So what they did is they would come to the Muslims, and they would say, support our movement. And the way that you show support for our movement, for example, is bowing to a picture of Sun Yat-sen. This is something amazing. This is shirk. And the Yihwanis, they said, no problem. So when we say the Yihwanis, we're not talking about the Ikhwanis in the Middle East. They would say this is shirk. But the Yihwanis in China, getting caught up in the nationalist movement, they said, no problem. Give us respect. Let us have our generals remain here.
It's for dunya.
For the dunya.
Oh, for dunya and maybe for jahl. For
out of ignorance. A lot of these generals, they weren't Muslim scholars. They started to justify. Some of them, for example, they'd find a hadith. They'd say, there's many ahadith which say we should support the Kuomintang. There's something absurd. How are you going to find words of the Prophet ﷺ saying you should obey the Kuomintang and Sun Yat-sen? But they started to twist the religion. And you find, for example, every year, the Kuomintang, they would go to a certain lake, and they would worship the god of the lake. And the Yihwanis, they would come along and they would worship the god of the lake. And so this is something
and they still consider themselves Muslims while they were doing this.
They would call themselves Muslims.
Muslim by name only.
Muslim by name. So this is leading up to the communist revolution. So inshallah, we're going to stop for a very short break. After this, inshallah, we're going to conclude with the communist revolution and Islam in China today. So dear viewers, do stay tuned. We're going to be back after a short moment. We'll see you then.
Our legacy.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, dear viewers. We're looking at the history of Islam with a specific focus on the history of Islam in China. So as we were looking at, after the nationalist revolution of the Kuomintang, you found the Muslims were divided into many groups. You had the Qadimu, the old-style Muslims. Then you had the Ikhwanis, or the Yihawani. They were more, saying that we should, abandon Confucian philosophy, but at the same time, they too became corrupt over time. So you found another group appeared. They were known as the Salafi. Salafi, you can't really hide what this means.
All the groups of Muslim nowadays.
All of the groups, they were there.
Salafi and Qadimu, oh my goodness.
So you had, a group, Salafiyya, in China. So they really grew out in response to the Yihawani. They said, you guys have sold out. You said we need to go back to the basics of Islam, but now you're showing your ignorance. So the Salafi, as they call themselves, Salafi, they actually became very hated. So the Ikhwanis, the Yihawani, united with the nationalist government to attack the Salafis. And you found that the Yihwanis, as we said, there was the Ma group, these 5 generals, they actually ended up conquering 1/5 of China. This is in the past 100 years. They conquered 1/5 of China. Regions like Ningxia, Lingsha, all of these, the Uyghur regions, they come under the control of the Muslim generals. But they put in this form of Islam, which really, it was ignorance. It involved shirk, worshipping pictures and the lake gods, something which really wasn't suitable. Naam. So what's interesting to see at this point is after the nationalist revolution, you had the communists. And the communists wanted to overthrow the nationalists. As I'm sure you had heard about Chairman Mao Zedong, and the Chinese Revolution. So it was a communist revolution. Now the communists in general were atheists. They were anti-religion. Now it's interesting to see that the Salafis at this time actually supported the communists.
Why?
How?
It's going to sound very strange.
Why?
How could a Salafi support a communist? It's going to sound very strange.
Yes.
The reason why is because we saw the nationalists, the Kuomintang, supported the Ikhwanis, the Yihawani.
So it was like a disunity. The Muslims are united with the enemy of Muslims against Muslims.
Yes.
So it is always about this disunity, about greedy for
disunity came
dunya.
about. And the reason why is because, as we said, the Kuomintang, hated the Salafis and they preferred the Ikhwanis. But the communists hated everyone equally. They didn't discriminate in their hatred. So the Salafis sort of thought, we're better off with the communists than the Kuomintang, who were going to favor shirk and kufr and all of these things. So you can see, there's some political strategy in it, even though it seems mind-boggling. How a Muslim, someone saying a Salafi could support the communists. But this was the reality. Now we know, as we saw in the communist revolution, the armies of Mao Zedong were victorious, and they overthrew the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang were exiled to the Republic of China, or what we call Taiwan, and China itself became the People's Republic of China, or Communist China.
And what happened for the Ikhwani?
Of course, after that time, the Ikhwani lost support completely. Up until today, the Ikhwani sort of died out. The Salafis, they were led by a man named Mahdi Bao. Mahdi Bao was the leader of the Salafis, and they're still active today.
If the Salafis and the communists, if the Salafis supported the communists, then why are the communists today oppressing the Muslims?
Because, as we said, the communists hated everyone equally. So they didn't prefer one group over the other.
I think especially Muslims. If you look at that, I think that they hated especially Muslims.
There was a time, you find, in the beginning, under the PRC, under the communists, what they did is they started to really outlaw religion. The religion they hated the most was Christianity, because they saw that the Christians supported the nationalist movement. The nationalists were led by a Christian. So you find that the communists really cracked down on the Christians, but they weren't easy on the Muslims either. They destroyed many masjids. Many masajid were destroyed. Qur'ans were destroyed. You found that Islam became regulated by the government. They started to do very strange things. Like they would build a masjid just for women, and they'd have women imams. It's the only place in the world where you find this, that there's the masjid for the men and the masjid for the women. This is something the communists did, because they wanted to break the people apart, break the society. They made it illegal to attend the masjid if you're under 18. If you are under 18, it's illegal to actually study the Quran.
in some parts it's similar to the prohibitions in Jerusalem in the Israeli government. They prohibit all Muslims, I think, under 40 to enter the Masjid al-Aqsa.
Yeah, you find this happening today. This is a tactic that was used by the communists.
It was a war against Islam, not against the people.
It was what they called it was called the Cultural Revolution. They started to say we need to redefine our culture because the communists were atheists.
It was religion. It was clear it was religion, not culture.
It became their religion. The religion of the people became communism, and they at the expense of Islam, at the expense of Christianity.
Why do they think communism is best for the country? Why does anyone think communism is best for a country?
This is something which really deserves a complete talk by itself. But when you don't believe in Allah, when you're not taking your morals from a divine high purpose, basically the communists took their religion as being defining the human not as a slave of Allah, not as a creation of Allah, but as a worker. Degrading him from someone who's been honored by Allah to just being a worker and worrying about his rights. And they would say if you're going to be a good worker, religion's going to get in the way. Put religion aside.
Yani communism, they have no God.
No, they don't believe in any gods. They're actually they're atheists completely. Now, what actually happened at that time, as I said, under the communists, they really started to oppress the Muslims. The Muslims had no rights. It was said during the Cultural Revolution, what they would do is they would get all of the Muslim students in the universities, in Beijing and all of the eastern parts, and during Ramadan, they would force them to drink and eat in front of the whole class. And if they didn't, you'd be thrown out. You'd get Muslims, Muslims who were in the Communist Party. They were forced to eat pork. You had to eat pork. And you find this happens until today.
It's similar maybe in Russia and in Bosnia and in other parts.
In a lot of countries nowadays. I heard that they did that with the same way in China, like soon.
Yeah, actually, I have friends in my class, and they told me when they lived in China, they would basically, get pork and make it put it like soy sauce and basically just tell them it was beef just to trick them for no reason.
Yeah,
I don't know.
because that would demoralize the Muslims. You're taking away the cornerstones of their society.
Yeah,
you're making them feel like hypocrites.
Some sort of regulation, so to speak, amongst Muslims in the Uyghur provinces of China, especially through Ramadan. I think still to this day, like you were talking about, limit people going to the masjids, performing tarawih, salat al-tarawih. And like the brother was mentioning, tricking people into eating swine and etc. etc.
No,
very
so
devious acts. Yeah.
From the golden age until then. Now, after 1978, once the government started to open up, you actually saw that things improved. So you see, up until today, and one of the main reasons why it improved is because the Chinese economy was booming. And if your economy is booming, you have to do trade with other countries. And whilst China was booming, the Middle East was booming. You had the oil boom. So the Chinese realized they're going to have to show some respect to the Muslims, otherwise they're going to lose in trades. So you even saw, recently, I'm sure you know of the Chinese astrological signs. Each year, the year of the rat, the year of the ox, and one of the years is the year of the pig. So what the Chinese government actually did is they said when it was the year of the pig, they outlawed public displays of pigs. Because they said if the Muslims see this, they're going to get very upset. It's amazing how the Communist Party really flipped from saying, forcing Muslims to eat pork to all of a sudden saying to the whole Chinese country, do not show any pigs to upset the Muslims.
What about the Uyghurs in China?
Unfortunately, what's happened, the Uyghurs are, they're not ethnic Chinese, they're not Hui, they're Turkic people. And the Uyghurs were really deprived of a lot of their rights. So you find that they had recently Uyghur rebellions, fighting against the government. When you were oppressed, I wish we could spend more time looking at what actually happened between the Uyghur rebellions. We saw this happening last year. This is another episode. We'd love to take a look at this.
They are killed, and they are now killing the pregnant wives amongst Muslims.
No, it's very unfortunate. And so we see the history of Islam in China, the high points, the golden age, up until where we are today. This is just a bit of information for everyone, so we hope we benefit from it, inshallah. And in the least, that we should make dua for the Muslims in China. May Allah ease their situation and return them to a situation of honor. So we thank you all for joining us in this episode, and we thank you, the viewers, for joining us, and we hope that you got as much benefit from this as we did. May Allah reward you all, and we hope to see you for future episodes. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.